7 districts, 7 hill councils, and one brand new institution above all of them. That's what Ladakh's Chief Secretary announced this week, and it's closest India has come in 7 years to answering a question it has been dodging since 2019.
7 years after the abrogation of Article 370, Ladakh is set to get one hill council each for its 7 districts with a proposed overarching union territory level body.
What Ladakh actually gets in exchange for losing its legislature. Not the 6th schedule status, which is what protesters marched to Delhi for, not full statehood, which remains the stated long-term goal on paper, but something else. A model officials are calling a customized Article 371 framework. And understanding why the centre chose this particular constitutional tool instead of the tool Ladakh actually asked for tells you almost everything about how Delhi thinks about border governance right now. Now let's just start with what happened on the ground. Ladakh's Chief Secretary Ashish Kundra confirmed that every one of Ladakh's 7 districts will get its own autonomous hill development council. Until now, elected local government in Ladakh meant exactly 2 bodies, the Leh and the Kargil Hill Council, each with 30 members, 26 elected and 4 nominated. Now that's the entire elected representation for a landmass roughly the size of Bulgaria. Ladakh only became a 7 district territory this April in 2026. When Leh and Kargil were carved into 5 additional districts: Sham, Nubra, Changthan, Zanskar and Dras. A decision the Home Ministry actually made back in August 2024 but took a year and a half to operationalize. Now multiplying 2 councils into 7 sounds like straightforward decentralization, and mostly it is, but the most consequential move is the one sitting above these 7 councils. A union territory level body that officials say will hold legislative, executive, financial and administrative powers, modeled loosely on the family of provisions under Article 371. To understand why that phrase customized Article 371 is doing so much work here, you need to understand the constitutional menu Delhi was choosing from. Article 371 and its offshoots, 371A through 371J, currently applies to 12 states. Maharashtra and Gujarat get regional development boards for backward areas like Vidarbha and Saurashtra. Nagaland's 371A blocks parliament from legislating on a Naga customary law or land without the state assembly's consent. Mizoram's 371G does something similar for Mizo custom, born out of the 1986 Mizo Accord that ended an insurgency. Sikkim's 371F preserves pre-merger property and citizenship rights dating to 1975. And Arunachal Pradesh 371H gives the governor discretionary power over law and order given it's a sensitive border with China. Now, every one of these provisions was written for a specific state with its own legislature, its own assembly, passing its own laws under that shield. Ladakh has none of that. It's a union territory without a legislature, which is exactly why customized is the operative word. Officials are explicit that there is no direct precedent for what they have been building. They're borrowing features from several existing 371 clauses and stitching them onto a territory doesn't have the basic legislative architecture those clauses assume. That absence of a legislature is the entire story of how Ladakh got here. See, when the parliament passed the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Act in 2019, abrogating 370, Ladakh was carved out as a separate union territory. But unlike J&K, which at least retained the promise of an elected assembly, Ladakh was given none. Now, for a region that had spent decades under the J&K state government, this meant an odd trade. Freedom from Srinagar's political dominance was there, but also the loss of any legislative body of its own. The 2 hill councils in Ladakh, which is the Leh and the Kargil, which had existed since 1990s, suddenly became the only elected institutions Ladakhis had, answering to a lieutenant governor and a bureaucracy accountable to Delhi rather than them. Now that vacuum is what produced the Leh apex body and the Kargil Democratic Alliance, an unusual pairing because Leh is a roughly Buddhist majority and Kargil is a Shia Muslim majority, and the 2 towns hadn't historically organized together, but by 2021 both were marching under shared 4-point charter. One demand was of statehood, second was inclusion in the 6th schedule of Indian Constitution, third was a separate Ladakh Public Service Commission and 2 Lok Sabha seats instead of 1, that is the 4th one, splitting representation between Leh and Kargil. Now the 6th schedule demand mattered the most because it's constitutionally the strongest form of tribal protection India has. It applies today in parts of Assam, Meghalaya, Meghalaya, Tripura and Mizoram, 4 states, and gives Autonomous District Council, as we call it as ADCs, the power to legislate on land, forest and local custom. Powers that can override ordinary state laws unless a governor intervenes. Now, for a 97% tribal population worried about outside land purchases and demographic change after losing JNK's old permanent resident protections, that kind of permanence embedded in the constitution rather than sitting in an executive order that any future government could reverse was actually the whole point. The center never gave it to them, of course, and the escalation that followed is worth walking through. Now, the reason is because it explains why Delhi finally moved. See, a high-powered committee was set up on January 2023 under the Ministry of State, which is under the Nityanand Rai. 9 rounds of talks by March 2024 produced nothing conclusive. Sonam Wangchuk, the education reformist turned activist, fasted for 5 days in the sub-zero temperatures in January 2023. Then 21 days in March 2024. In September and October 2024, he led roughly 100 people on a 1,000-kilometer march towards Delhi and was detained along with others for violating assembly orders. Talks stalled again through 2025. Then on September 24-25, after a fresh hunger strike in Leh drew no response from the government, protests then actually turned violent. Stone pelting was seen, arson, a BJP office burned, police firing that killed at least 4 people, including a Kargil war veteran, and left dozens injured. Now, it was by most accounts the most serious unrest Ladakh had seen since the early 1990s. Now, Wangchuk was detained under the National Security Act. The center released him in March 2026 as a trust-building gesture ahead of the Supreme Court hearing. That violence is what actually restarted serious negotiations. Between late 2025 and mid-2026, the two sides moved through a sequence of narrower agreements before touching the big constitutional question. First came the administrative fixes, a 15-year continuous residency rule to qualify for Ladakh domicile, notified in 2025. All non-gazetted government jobs reserved for domicile holders. 95% of the gazetted posts reserved for locals, split into 85% general category and 10% economically and weaker section people, and an official languages regulation recognizing English, Hindi, Urdu, Bhoti and Purgi with support extended to Shina, Brokskit, Malti and Ladakhi. These were real concessions, but every one of them was an executive regulation, reversible by the future government with a stroke of just a pen. It was not a constitutional guarantee. Ladakhi leaders kept saying so publicly, which is why the demand for something with constitutional weight never went away. And they kept on demanding that give us something in the constitution which can't be reversed easily. So the breakthrough on that front came on May 22nd, 2026, when a Delhi meeting produced what a Ladakhi leader, Thupstan Chiwang, called a historic agreement in principle. An elected UT level legislature, its executive head carrying status equivalent to a chief minister. It's a very important thing. And notably, bureaucrats in Ladakh, including the chief secretary, made answerable to that elected body for subjects under its control. See, it's a very remarkable thing and it's a very extraordinary thing. Now, this detail is worth sitting with because it would technically give Ladakhis and Ladakh's elected government more control over its own bureaucracy than the government of Jammu and Kashmir. Since in JNK, the All India Services officers still report to the Lieutenant Governor and not to the Chief Minister. A follow-up meeting in Leh on 3rd of July 2026 confirmed the minutes of that May agreement and moved into the operational weeds. A Ladakh Public Service Commission, Ladakh Administrative Services, Ladakh Police Services, all still being drafted rather than finalized, and it's in these same weeks that Kundra announced the 7 Hill Councils, which officials are framing as the first concrete, deliverable piece of a much larger structure still being negotiated on paper. Now, what's conspicuously missing from all this is the 6th schedule itself. Reports on the negotiations suggest that Ladakhi leadership essentially traded away the single demand that had defined the movement since 2021. Now, calculating that the center was never going to hand over a border union territory, a constitutional instrument that Kashmiri politicians could later cite as a precedent for restoring their own autonomy. The geography explains the rest of the caution. Ladakh sits against both the line of control with Pakistan and the line of actual control with China, carries one of the heaviest troop concentrations in the country, and every acre of land there is, in a very literal sense, a potential critical defense infrastructure in Ladakh. A model that has an elected council, legislative control over land use in that kind of a terrain is a very different proposition for the Ministry of Home Affairs than it is in, let's say, the states like Meghalaya or Tripura. So the customized Article 371 framework is in that sense an attempt to thread a genuinely narrow needle to give Ladakhis a legislature, a chief minister equivalent and financial control while keeping land and strategic decisions making close enough to Delhi that it doesn't look to security planners like ceding ground in the most contested stretch of India's northern frontier. Now, none of this is finalized. The draft proposal on the UT's body's actual powers hasn't been published. Its relationship to the PRI's Panchayati Raj institutions and the new district hill councils haven't been settled as of now. And Ladakhi civil society groups have said they'll submit their own competing draft once they have consulted legal experts. Now, what is settled for the first time since 2019 is the shape of the compromise, not the sixth schedule Ladakh asked for, not full statehood either, but a legislature-shaped institution built from Article 371's spare parts, and whether that satisfied a population that buried 4 people in September 2025 will depend entirely on how much power actually ends up written into that document and how soon. Now, is it what Ladakh demanded? Of course not. But is it something which will help Ladakh in decentralization of power and help Ladakhi people get decision-making power in their own hands? Of course, yes. Now, should more be done and should Ladakh be given statehood? Should it be under the 6th schedule of Indian Constitution? That is a question which you need to answer in the comment section. Do let me know what are your views regarding this in the comment section. I'll be happy to read your comments. All the very best. Have a beautiful day. And I hope you gained a new perspective from this session. Thank you.